Without further ado, our first talk is on extended intelligence, and our speakers are David Barrick and Drew Jaegle. David Barrick is a researcher in philosophy and neuroscience at the University of Pennsylvania. His work in neuroscience explores the basis of foraging decisions in humans and non-human primates. His philosophical work explores the conceptual foundations of cognitive neuroscience, especially the underlying dynamical basis for cognition and the foraging foundations of reasoning. Drew Jaegle is a senior research scientist at DeepMind in London, and his work focuses on perceptual reasoning in AI, including the development of domain-agnostic architectures for large-scale learning and algorithms for imitation and reinforcement learning from observations. So again, together they're going to be discussing extended intelligence, and I'll pass it over to them. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. Thank you, Henry and Karina and Ali, for having Drew and I on today. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. And I'll launch right into it. So today I'm going to be discussing extended intelligence. Ooh, let me make sure this works. Yes. Intelligence is a disposition to behave successfully at tasks. Because the grounds of this disposition extend beyond the agent, we argue that intelligence is properly a property of agents in context. We call this the thesis of extended intelligence. Intelligence is a property of systems made up of agents and their contexts. In this paper, we argue for this thesis. We also discuss three implications from the thesis. Intelligence is context-bound, task-particular, and incommensurable. The standard analysis of intelligence in artificial intelligence and psychology assumes that individual agents are intelligent, can perform many different tasks, and can be compared, rather than focusing on the development of individual AI or psychological systems that optimize a single general measure of intelligence, such as G, universal intelligence, or other measures. We argue that the analysis of intelligence should not focus on agents in isolation. Socially, an individual's intelligence should be analyzed in terms of the individual's role within the group, how the individual performs this role, and how the individual's performance in this role contributes to the group's success and the group's environmental niche. Ecologically, an individual's intelligence should be analyzed in terms of the interaction between the agent and its environment. Intelligence is a property of a larger system of which the individual agent is merely a part. The description of how well an agent behaves requires terms for both agent and environment, because intelligence can only be assessed in particular environments. Let's see here. Here we go. We've defined intelligence as a disposition to behave successfully at tasks. We argue that the grounds for this disposition extend beyond the boundaries of the agent, and ultimately the best explanation of these external grounds is that the relevant system is an agent in context. When agents are removed from adaptive context, the ability to accomplish particular tasks drops precipitously. Conversely, when agents are placed in adaptive context, the ability to accomplish particular tasks increases. Hence, an agent's disposition to behave successfully on particular tasks is inextricably context dependent. Because different contexts result in different levels of performance for the same agent, and the same context with different agents yields different levels of performance, the grounds for intelligence extend beyond the agent. As an example, consider the case of Otto, somewhat displayed here, taken from Clark and Chalmers in 1998. Famous paper on extended cognition. In that example, Otto has Alzheimer's disease and keeps a notebook to remember how to navigate around Manhattan. Let's see if I can get to a pointer. Here we are. So Otto is intelligent because he is successful in navigation when he is equipped with his notebook. Remove his notebook, however, and he fails to be able to successfully navigate. Hence, the notebook is part of the grounds for the disposition to navigate successfully. Similar points apply to Otto's environment. Otto's intelligence is grounded both in his cognitive machinery, the representations and computations in his brain, and in his environment, the notebook, the city, and so forth. From the extended grounds for Otto's disposition, however, we cannot simply conclude that intelligence is also extended. The grounds for a disposition might be external to a system without the implication that the system that possesses the disposition must be extended to include those grounds. A plant has the disposition to take in carbon dioxide and breathe out oxygen. This disposition requires both oxygen and carbon dioxide to manifest, but that does not imply that the oxygen and carbon dioxide are part of the plant. So the objection goes, why should the fact that the grounds for intelligence extend beyond the agent imply that intelligence is a property of agents in context. Why think environment, society, and other aspects of agents in context are parts of the system that possesses the disposition. Our reply to this objection will proceed in 2 steps. First, we will establish that in the cases of intelligence, the system has been misidentified. We develop what we call the auto-think test to aid in the determination of whether a system has been correctly identified. This test merely indicates that something is missing from a system, but not what. Second, we will argue that what is missing can be settled by looking at a range of counterfactuals. The grounds for dispositions in these counterfactuals tell us what of the extended grounds are to be included as part of the system that has the disposition. What is a disposition? The simple conditional analysis of dispositions, which is shown here on the screen, is that something X is disposed at time t to give response R to stimulus S if and only if X were to undergo stimulus S at time t, X would give response R. The existence of what are called thinks challenges this simple conditional analysis of dispositions and is central to our discussion. A thinked system X is disposed at time t to give response R to stimulus S, but if X were to undergo S at t, X would not give R because of the think. So the conceptual apparatus of the think is useful regardless of the probity of the simple conditional analysis. And we actually don't endorse the simple conditional analysis, but we will be using the notion of a think in order to try to determine whether or not a system has been correctly identified. Consider a system X consisting of a battery, copper wire, and a bulb socket. To operate the system, we screw the bulb in, which depresses a catch on the bulb, exposing a conductive surface in the bulb and putting it in contact with a corresponding conductive surface on the interior of the socket. System X has a disposition to light bulbs, but can this disposition be attributed to any of the constituent parts or subsystems of the system? We argue not. The system with 3 parts, the bulb, the socket, and the battery, the socket, the battery, and the wire, is minimal as a processor of the disposition in the sense that removing any of its parts without replacement prevents the manifestation of the disposition. Consider the possible subsystems to which we might hope to attribute the disposition. To illustrate, briefly consider the battery alone. The battery is disposed to induce a voltage in wires that are attached to it, but voltage induction is not sufficient to possess a disposition to light a bulb. Mere voltage induction will not light a bulb if, for example, the wire or the socket is removed. There is no possible world, in other words, in which we can omit the transmitting and connecting elements from the wiring diagram and preserve the disposition to light the bulb. Similar analyses hold for the remaining subsystems consisting of the various single elements like the wire or the socket alone, or pairs of elements like the battery and the socket. How can we identify then the systems that have particular dispositions? We contend that a proper identification of a system relies on the identification of dispositions susceptible to thinks, but not auto-thinks, which I'll discuss in a moment. The identification of a system, is this working? Let's see here. This is no longer working. Yes, I see. I think I see the problem. The identification of a system is the identification of the parts of the system and their dispositions that together compose the system and its dispositions. A properly identified system can be thinked. Upon stimulation by some S, the system may fail to respond due to a think that disrupts the manifestation of the disposition. On the other hand, for a given disposition D, if the system is misidentified, then the system can be an auto-think. But auto-thinks are impossible, where an auto-think is a system that is its own think. Suppose some system X and some other system X prime that is the think of X. Suppose X has the disposition D, and suppose for contradiction that X is equal to X prime. If X prime is the think of X, then there's some part P of X prime that prevents the manifestation of D. Since P is part of X prime and X equals X prime, P is part of X. But if P is part of X, then X can't have the disposition, since it is not the case that if X were stimulated by S, then X would respond R. But by hypothesis, the system has the disposition. So X must not be identical to X prime, or X does not in fact have the disposition. This proof requires the truth of some counterfactual that describes the situation in which the system manifests the disposition. We don't propose this counterfactual condition as an analysis of dispositions, but we are committed to the claim that if a system has a disposition, then there's some true counterfactual in which the disposition manifests. Autothinks can be used to diagnose whether a system has been correctly identified. For an arbitrary system X and disposition D, if X can be an autothink, then some supposition of the foregoing argument is false. Either X is not identical to X prime, or X does not have that disposition. Generally, whether to reject the system identification, namely that X is identical to X prime, or the presence of the disposition for an autothink system will depend on the best explanation of the autothink for the autothink of that system. We call this the autothink test. The crux of the first part of our reply to the objection then is this: when a system is properly identified, then the system is not an autothink. A think possesses the same disposition as the system, but does not manifest the response when properly stimulated as the first system. An autothink, in contrast, does not even possess the disposition. Or if we hold fixed the disposition, then the system must be improperly identified. The existence of a think is an indicia of a properly identified system, and the existence of an autothink of an improperly identified one. Take the case of the light bulb. Suppose for each of the possible subsystems, battery alone, wire alone, and so forth, we hypothesize that the subsystem has the disposition to light bulbs. Now suppose that the light bulb was screwed in to the socket. For each of those subsystems, the subsystem will not light bulbs when the bulb was screwed in. The bulb being screwed in here is the stimulus S. If we consider each subsystem as the system and maintain that the system does have the disposition to light bulbs, then the system is an autothink. But autothinks are impossible, and so some supposition is false. In the case of the light bulb, the best explanation of the seeming presence of the autothink is that the system does not, in fact, have the disposition to light bulbs. Now let's turn back to Otto. Recall that Otto is the forgetful patient who uses a notebook to navigate Manhattan. Which system possesses the disposition to successfully navigate? Is it really Otto, or is it Otto plus elements of his context, like the notebook? Suppose we leave out Otto's notebook in the identification of the system, but then Otto autothinks. When placed in Manhattan, Otto is unable to navigate successfully. The best explanation of this, of course, is that Otto is not disposed to navigate successfully due to his unfortunate illness. Now consider Otto prime, Otto plus the notebook. When placed in Manhattan, Otto prime is able to navigate successfully. And so supposing for this case that ability implies disposition, Otto prime is disposed to navigate successfully. In addition, Otto prime is not an autothink. So far, so good. The lessons that hold for Otto and Otto prime hold for intelligence generally. The disposition to behave successfully on tasks will, of course, mean different things in different task contexts. Granted the disposition to behave successfully on a task, however, the purported system that has the disposition cannot be an autothink. If the system autothinks, or the purported system autothinks, then the system has been misidentified. The autothink test is only the first step in the reply to the problem of external grounds for dispositions that are not parts of the system. For while the autothink test can determine that a system has been misidentified, it does not say what to include in a proper system identification. Some parts of the system are missing, parts that ground the system's dispositions, but nonetheless, there can be grounds for dispositions that are not part of systems. Take the oxygen that Otto prime relies on. If the oxygen is not included as a part of the system, then is the system an autothink? Recall above the counterfactual condition for autothinks. The attribution of a disposition to a system requires the truth of a counterfactual that describes a scenario in which the system manifests the disposition. We can keep Otto prime, namely Otto plus his notebook, fixed and consider a scenario where Otto prime manifests the disposition, that is, where Otto prime navigates successfully in Manhattan. Hence, the autothink test seemingly fails as desired. Now consider Otto prime's oxygen. The scenario wherein Otto prime successfully navigates might be one where oxygen is part of the system. That seems to beg the question of whether or not oxygen is part of the system, and consequently, whether or not Otto prime without oxygen can navigate successfully. This problem seems to generalize. For instance, if we leave out Otto's notebook, there's no counterfactual condition where we keep the system, in this case Otto, fixed and the system can navigate. But if the notebook were present in the counterfactual scenario, then Otto would navigate. So it appears that Otto only fails to navigate if we assume in the counterfactual that he has no notebook. That is, if we assume the notebook is not part of the system. But that begs the question, which is precisely whether or not the notebook is part of the system. Hence, the inclusion or exclusion of some part cannot be determined by the autothink test without begging the question. Something more is needed beyond that test. The crux of the second part of the reply, then, is that the internal grounds for dispositions are those conditions that can only be satisfied, only in some relevant counterfactual scenarios. Otto Prime's oxygen is external, but the notebook is not. Take oxygen first. In no counterfactual scenarios can Otto Prime navigate successfully without oxygen. But in no counterfactual scenarios where oxygen is absent can Otto Prime do anything at all. So oxygen is required for all relevant counterfactual scenarios, in this case, namely those related to navigation, but also the irrelevant ones. Now consider the notebook. The presence of the notebook is required only for relevant counterfactuals. There are many irrelevant counterfactual scenarios where Otto can do many other things, but the notebook is present in the navigational ones. Finally, consider a stylus that you might use to write in a notebook, for example. The stylus is present in some range of navigational counterfactuals, but only a limited subset, much fewer than the notebook. So must the parts of systems be present in all relevant counterfactual scenarios? We don't think so. In the absence of a notebook, for example, Otto might also be able to navigate where he's given a computer. The mere addition of the notebook then is not necessary, but there must be some artificial device to make up for the lost memory. Besides this functional objection, there's a concern about the environment. Given a simple enough environment like a single track, Otto might be able to navigate it even without the notebook. As a result, the task environment is also relevant for the determination of the relevant range of counterfactuals that must be satisfied by a system plus some external grounds in order for the external grounds to be considered part of the system. Of course, Otto's necessary for all these scenarios. If you don't have Otto, Otto's not going to navigate. So there must be additional constraints on which parts of this system are considered essential and which are not. And in our formulation, in our estimation, the agent's going to be such a necessary part. But what else in the agent's context is to be included as part of the relevant system for the disposition to behave successfully is going to depend on the task at hand. As a consequence of these and similar concerns, there must be a range of relevant counterfactuals within which the relevant system possesses the disposition, the system under assessment. In the case of Otto Prime, there's a range of counterfactuals that describe scenarios within which Otto Prime can navigate. Oxygen is ruled out as part of the system because its absence rules out not just those counterfactuals related to navigation, but many others beside. And the notebook is included as part of the system because the notebook is needed for the right range of counterfactuals related to navigation. We propose that that right range, that relevant range of scenarios, is partly determined by the task in which the disposition of the agent and context is manifest. In general, those grounds that are parts of the system will line up in some sense with only those counterfactual scenarios that manifest the disposition as determined by the task. In sum, intelligence is a property of agents in context. Changing context changes the ability of the system to behave successfully. These extended grounds imply that the proper system is the agent in context. Not all such grounds are part of the relevant system, however. The autothink test can tell us whether the system is misidentified, and the range of counterfactuals determined by the task can tell us what grounds are part of the system and what are not. Applied to intelligence, the disposition to behave successfully is a property of agents in context. Having argued for the thesis of extended intelligence, we turn now to three implications of the view. First, intelligence is context-bound. Since agents and contexts are the proper bearers of intelligent dispositions, intelligence itself cannot be divorced from the context of the agents whose behavior is estimated to be intelligent. Second, intelligence is task particular. Different tasks imply different contexts, and since only agents and contexts are properly speaking intelligent, intelligence will be defined only with respect to some task or other. Finally, third, since different agents will exist in different contexts and be posed with different tasks, intelligence is incommensurable. Comparing across agents in context is ill-posed. The first implication of our thesis is that the particular context in which agents act is a necessary feature of intelligent systems. When denuded of the context to which an agent has adapted, usually as a result of both evolution as well as learning, an agent's ability to accomplish cognitive tasks will drop precipitously. Hence, the effectiveness of an agent on any task is not independent of context, but rather depends on the context in which it is assessed. To illustrate, consider side by side a master Mousterian toolmaker, here Fred, and a button pusher of the year 3000, here George. Fred is equipped with the most sophisticated tools of his time, and he has devoted years of practice and experimentation to their mastery that allow him to manufacture the sharpest, most reliable axes available. George, on the other hand, was raised in a luxurious, fully automated world, and his work consists of pushing just a handful of buttons. These buttons, however, control a sophisticated set of manufacturing protocols that are able to produce a huge number of tools and parts and can operate even if George is inattentive. Who's more intelligent, George or Fred? We might be tempted to point at Fred. Fred has succeeded in mastering one of the most challenging domains of his time, which is flint knapping, which is manufacturing hand axes. But Fred's output is vastly inferior to George's, who can produce high quality tools of far greater consistency and utility than Fred's with much less effort. Further, any modern test of general intelligence would condemn Fred, sadly. George, on the other hand, benefits on such tests from his futuristic and rich upbringing. Of course, if we were to base our intelligence tests on the skills necessary in Fred's world, then George would fail miserably. In the end, the intelligence of the system can only be properly attributed to Fred in his world or George in his, with all the accoutrements, bells, and whistles that may imply. In Objection, if we mean that agents can vary greatly in intelligence based on their capacities in different environments, aren't we implicitly endorsing the proper domain of the applicability of the predicate is intelligent to agents and not agents in context, as our thesis claims? By moving agents between contexts, a given agent can be used as part of different agents in context, which are disposed to successfully perform different tasks. With respect to a fixed set of reference tasks, agent A will perform better as part of some agent in context systems than others. Suppose we have an agent A that, along with environments X and Y, can constitute an agent in context A and X or A and Y. A is adapted to X, but not Y. In context A is disposed to behave successfully on a large set of tasks, whereas A and Y is not. The possibility of A and Y means that A cannot be called intelligent simpliciter. In context other than X, A is not disposed to behave successfully on nearly any task. But A and X can be called intelligent, as this system is disposed to behave successfully. In other words, when we call an agent A intelligent, that is just shorthand for A and X is intelligent. The second implication of our thesis is that intelligence is properly analyzed only for particular tasks. Can an agent perform very well at a single task and be considered intelligent, or must the agent be good at many different things? On our view, agents in context are intelligent. But since a change in context can change the task, tasks are context dependent. Take, for example, the task of completing a math exam with and without a calculator. These distinct contexts will engage different operations, the use of a calculator requiring certain skills that are not required for completing the test without it. But since tasks can change with context and intelligence is a property of agents in context, intelligence is also task particular. In addition, the capacities of agents are shaped by the context in which they act. For example, bounded agents, those with limited memory, processing power, attention, and so forth, will adapt to their local selective environments because they are resource constrained. Such adaptiveness suggests that intelligence is task particular, as different contexts will dictate different trade-offs amongst the constraints. So both considerations of context and agents imply that intelligence is task particular. But how to differentiate different tasks? We adopt a formal principle for counting tasks and differentiating them. If the mathematical description of a task is distinct from and cannot be reduced to the mathematical description of another, then the tasks are distinct. This approach, incidentally, also helps restrict the range of relevant counterfactuals for determining which of the external grounds of intelligent dispositions are to be included as parts of the system. The third implication of our thesis is that the intelligence of an agent in context is incommensurable to another agent in context. So both our Mousterian flint knapper as well as our advanced modern day robots are equally intelligent in their context. Potentially, they have to be adjudicated based on agent in context. But is that the case? Can they even be compared, even in context? The disposition to behave successfully in tasks is incommensurable across systems because the agent and context jointly determine which behaviors are relevant to task performance. The adaptive argument for task particularity also implies incommensurability because agents' behaviors are adapted to their local selective environments, and different agents may selectively adapt to their different environments. The implications of context boundedness and task particularity, those first two implications of our thesis, further imply that intelligence is incommensurable across agents. So we can actually compare agent in context to another agent in context. This implication directly bears on attempts in psychology and artificial intelligence to define a single general measure of intelligence that can be used to compare agents. Consider, for instance, Spearman's G in psychology. This value is purportedly had to a greater or lesser degree by different people and to be revealed through the use of factor analysis and IQ tests. But if the foregoing arguments are right, then there's no sense in which an agent has G to greater or lesser degree. Instead, the tasks used to assess the system and the context in which the assessment is performed are essential to the intelligence of the system. The second consequence of this implication of our argument is that the notion of a general artificial intelligence, or AGI, is incoherent unless the operative notion of generality is somehow qualified. This doesn't imply that current approaches to developing agents that solve many tasks are fruitless. Doesn't mean that theoretical analyses along those lines are incoherent and so forth. We contend that each of these cases should actually be analyzed as a particular task within a particular context. Finally, strictly speaking, saying that A and X is intelligent and B and Y is intelligent are making different claims. Intelligence is essentially linked to context and task. So really, the full claim should be something like A and X is intelligent relative to context X and task T. We simply don't endorse the notion of intelligence simpliciter. In conclusion, neither AI systems nor humans are intelligent or not. Extended intelligence, as we have presented it and argued for it, is not a linguistic thesis about the meaning of the term, an epistemological thesis about how we come to know how a system is intelligent, or a methodological one about how to assess intelligence. Rather, it is a metaphysical claim about the systems that can be called intelligent, or intelligent in context on tasks. The truth makers of statements about the intelligence of agents are the states of affairs of those agents behaving in a context and performing a particular task. And so the truth of such claims is derivative from a more fundamental metaphysical truth about a system that extends beyond the mere agent. AI is intelligent because the artificial agent is situated in a context that includes a cultural milieu, possibly a human society, an environment, real or simulated, and this agent in context is intelligent. Similarly, humans are intelligent because they're situated in a cultural milieu that contains other humans, animal minds, tools, and so forth, and this human in context is intelligent. In short, intelligence is extended, a property of agents and their cultural, social, and environmental contexts.
So our next speaker is Simon Brown, and Simon will be speaking on, his talk will be called Narratives, Reinforcement Learning, and Death in Other Animals. And I'd just like to introduce Simon. Simon is a postdoctoral fellow in the Foundations of Mind at Johns Hopkins University, and he works on philosophy of mind, cognitive science, and neuroscience. And he's especially interested in animal minds, different kinds of memory, and the representation of time. So once again, just thanks to the previous speakers, and Simon, I'll hand the floor over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Karina. Thanks to Henry and in absentia Ali as well for this really exciting series. Now I'm just going to try flipping through these slides, and if you could just tell me if you can actually see them moving. You can? Okay, good. So that wasn't working earlier, so cool. All right, so I'm going to be talking about a bunch of things, trying to kind of link some very different literatures together. So I'm certainly going to be talking about narratives and reinforcement learning. I kind of suspect that I'm not going to have time to talk about death, but if you want to ask about that, then that's great. Okay, so let's start by just thinking about kind of two different pictures of what intertemporal rationality is and what kind of implications they have. So one picture is hopefully pretty familiar. It's what I would call kind of the maximization picture. And here, intertemporal practical rationality is really about maximizing expected utility, or maximizing, the total sum of discounted expected utilities, something like that. Now, this picture has, it's a really nice formal framework for lots of purposes. And one nice thing about it is that it lends itself to thinking in terms of reinforcement learning algorithms, because they're kind of, in a way, designed so that an agent can kind of approximate or in the long run converge on the kind of set of actions which will maximize expected utility. And another kind of feature of this view is, notice that humans, we're probably capable of kind of calculating directly, like, what is the total utility expected from this course of action, from this course of action, and then deciding in those terms. But it's really rare that we do this, and most humans are not capable of doing this, at least without a lot of education. And so it kind of actually, although it's quite a kind of highfalutin account of rationality, the result is that humans and animals are kind of in the same boat in an interesting sense, because we're both kind of mainly making decisions using things, heuristics or reinforcement learning or some kind of grab bag of tricks which kind of approximate rationality without kind of directly doing the kind of ideally rational thing. So that's one kind of picture. And then the other picture, which I'm really kind of drawing from this like specific paper, which is kind of old but really interesting, by David Fellerman from 1991. And it's, although I think there's kind of versions of this kind of floating around in lots of places. And here, the intertemporal rationality isn't just about maximizing expected utility, because what matters to what, one life is better than another, or one set of choices over time is better than another, isn't just the kind of sum of utility. It's also something about the overall shape of how that utility is structured, and something about how or even how the actions are structured into a narrative. And so some kind of associated views with this kind of picture of rationality. So one is, like, it doesn't lend itself to algorithms, because, the narrative structure of stuff matters, and you can only really appreciate this if you kind of have this aesthetic appreciation, which is sort of not algorithmically definable, or not by some simple algorithm, or there's some kind of view like that in the background. But also when it comes to animals, it actually kind of makes a little bit of a wedge between humans and other animals, because animals are probably not capable of thinking about narratives at all, or at least kind of really complicated narratives. Whereas with humans, it's pretty plausible that ordinary humans do at least sometimes think about their lives in terms of narratives, and make decisions on that kind of basis. Okay, so my aim today is really to kind of defend the maximization picture against the kind of arguments which Velleman gives in that paper for the narrative view. And so I'll go through his arguments, and I'll basically, like, his arguments are really kind of saying, look, there are these intuitions about intertemporal choice, which you can really explain if you think that narratives are important to rationality, and you can't really explain them on other views. And I'm going to say, well, no, actually, that's not true. Like, you can give this kind of independently motivated view within the kind of maximization picture, where you say, look, there are actually reasons that we would care about narratives, and those reasons are not that narratives are important to rationality itself. It's, well, actually, the narratives are just playing a role of a heuristic tool, and they're kind of filling in a role where reinforcement learning wouldn't work, or wouldn't work perfectly. And so if that's right, we can kind of explain away these intuitions while also kind of holding on to some kind of version of the maximization view. Okay, so what are these intuitions? So we start with just the intuition that which life is better, or which course of action is better, depends not just on the total sum of utility, but also on the shape of utility over time. So we can consider two lives, and one of them, it starts off with low utility, and then that utility kind of goes up. And the other one, it starts off high and then goes down. And we can just kind of stipulate, well, actually, whatever you're maximizing, these things have the same sum, right? So if it's discounted expected utility, whatever, we can just set up the case so that by stipulation, it's the same sum. But nonetheless, the intuition is, well, we might care about the shape. So we might prefer the life where things get better later on. And this seems to be quite a common kind of intuition. And so Sloat talks about this in this 1982 paper, and he basically says, look, we just have this kind of brute intuition, this brute kind of preference for certain shapes of utility. And Velleman kind of says, no, that's not what's going on. We can give a deeper explanation for this preference, right? And the deeper explanation is basically, well, we're kind of imputing a narrative to these different lives. So what we don't care about isn't really, like, we don't really care about the shape itself. What we care about is the kind of narrative structure to the life. And we're kind of reading into those lives something like, well, in the one case, you start off really fortunate and then you squander all your opportunities, and then life gets terrible. And whereas in the other case, you kind of start off really unfortunate, but you kind of struggle through and then you're rewarded at the end of all these struggles. And so, this kind of gives a deeper explanation of these preferences. You don't just have to have like a weird, like brute preference about the shape of utility, which seems like a weird thing to have. You can also explain various other features of these preferences. So you can explain like why it seems to matter exactly which way we describe these different lives. So, you could describe the same shape of utility as, well, you start off with a really hard life and then you struggle through and you get rewarded. And that seems like a pretty good life to have, a pretty good life story to kind of live for. Whereas the other, you could have a life which has the same structure of utility over time. And it's actually just like, well, to begin with, it's not that you're unlucky or unfortunate, it's you have all these opportunities, but you just don't take advantage of them. And then later in life, you just get lucky. And so you end up getting higher utility later on, nonetheless. And so the intuition is supposed to be, well, actually, we care about the difference between those two as well. So what's going on here is the narrative, not just the shape. And you can also explain a bunch of other preferences you might have about shape. So, you might not like a life where you just have kind of like a spike in utility, which is so high that it offsets a pretty mediocre life for most of the rest of the time. Okay, so that looks pretty good. And I think that's a pretty good, I think the idea that narratives are informing these preferences in some way is pretty well supported. It's just I'm going to kind of give a deeper explanation again for these narratives. Okay, so why might we want to give a deeper explanation for these narratives? Well, we can start off, there are some kind of initial worries you might have for the narrative picture, for the idea that we rationally should, or at least can, care about the narrative structure of the life. One is just, there's kind of, it feels a bit suspicious, it feels a bit sentimental to kind of want to live your life like the hero in a novel. And actually there are quite a few characters within literature where there's something kind of pitiful or kind of inauthentic, or things go wrong because they're trying to live their lives like a character in a romance novel, or Don Quixote is interpreting everything as he's a knight and he's trying to live like a hero in this kind of unrealistic sense. So there's a suspicion of that kind of thing might be going on, and that probably shouldn't be playing into narratives, into rationality. There's also this worry, well, if you look into the life of any interesting person, you can get multiple biographies of that same person. And those biographies might both be true in the sense that they both kind of include only true events, but they might tell very different narratives. They might include, put different events into more prominence, and they might both be kind of capturing something important about that life, but neither is the narrative of your life, right? And so if which course of action we take should depend on which one has the better narrative, that really seems like it ought to depend on there being one best narrative, or one narrative which a life is meeting, and that's just probably a bit unrealistic. Also, notoriously, narratives often distort, they simplify, they leave things out, they miss various things, and that just seems to be kind of part of storytelling. And so, should we really be allowing these things into rationality? And then another reason you might be suspicious again is just, look, there are some lives where, it's really narratively satisfying in some sense, but it's probably not a good life to lead and not a rational life to lead. And so an example of this might be like Don Giovanni, who lives this terrible life, and then a kind of statue comes to life and says, "I'm going to drag you down to hell unless you repent now." And Don Giovanni says, "No, I shall never repent," and he kind of sticks to his guns and gets dragged down to hell. And that's really narratively fantastic. Like, it's a really great piece of opera and drama, but nonetheless, probably not the most rational decision. So you need some kind of explanation for why that is. Okay, so I think these kind of worries motivate going back to the more kind of maximization-based account of rationality, and just like see, well, can we motivate some of these narrative preferences in a different way? And so remember I said that probably, well, a nice kind of fit with the maximization story about rationality is the idea that a lot of our decisions are made through reinforcement learning. And Julia gave a really great talk about this yesterday, so I'm not going to go through all the details of reinforcement learning. But what we need for today to understand is just look, the way that reinforcement learning works is basically you have this thing called a value function, which is getting updated through a clever kind of algorithm. And it's getting updated in such a way that it comes to track the kind of long-term total rewards which are going to be associated with a particular action or a particular state. And then that's going to allow you to maximize total rewards because you can just kind of pick the actions or states which have the highest value. And this is a really nice trick because it means that you don't have to actually calculate the total rewards. You can just do this kind of very, like, much simpler kind of incremental updating of your value function. But the reason that this incremental updating kind of works is that you can kind of decompose the long-term rewards associated with a particular state into kind of two components, right? So one is just kind of the immediate rewards from the action, and then one is the rewards from kind of the expected long-term rewards from the next state which you'll be in after taking this action. And this is kind of really essential to how RL works, but it depends on this thing called the Markov property. Okay, so what is the Markov property? Well, it can be a little bit hard to get your head around, but basically the idea is the stuff which I do now can affect stuff like way into the future, but it only affects it via the intervening times, right? So there's no kind of action at a distance, temporally speaking. So, I can affect stuff immediately in the future, and that can affect stuff after that, but I can't kind of directly affect stuff way into the future. And similarly for the past, there's just kind of no skipping time steps. Okay, so why would the Markov property fail? Well, pretty much the main reason is, if we're unaware of something, there's some kind of hidden mechanism in the world, there's some kind of changes going on which we can't see, then even if the underlying world is Markovian, there are going to be these temporal gaps from our perspective, right? So to take an example, so suppose that we're observing Alice throughout her life, and in 2002, she's kind of snubbed, there's some insult to her, and then she kind of secretly is plotting for years, and we're not realizing that that's what she's doing. As far as we can tell, she's just kind of going about her life as before. But then suddenly in 2021, there's this huge change, or apparent change, and she suddenly kind of wreaks her revenge, goes crazy, kills everyone, whatever. Now, from our perspective, we can explain that if we can reach back in time and say, well, look, this thing in 2002 affected this thing in 2021. But our observations are not going to tell us about the fact that she was plotting in between. So it's going to look non-Markovian to us. Okay, so if you start thinking about it, when you're in a kind of social context and there are, people are doing lots of stuff which you can't directly observe, the world is going to look pretty non-Markovian in quite a lot of cases. And so this is, if RL really depends on the Markov assumption, it's kind of a limitation, right? It's going to go wrong in certain kinds of situations. And so, you might hope, well, either we need to kind of fix RL, like add something to it, or RL should be kind of used alongside some other process. So as for kind of fixing RL, it's kind of an active research program in kind of computer science to try and do versions of RL which don't rely on the Markov assumption. And there are various things which have been proposed, but my sense from the literature is that there's nothing which is kind of a general solution which works really well in lots of different cases. All of the solutions out there, they kind of either require really restrictive assumptions instead of the Markov assumption, or they use kind of masses of data and computation. And the kind of underlying reason for this is just, look, if you're trying to avoid making the Markov assumption, then you have to start looking for possible causes of effects which you've observed kind of back in time, right? And so that's just going to kind of explode the number of possible causes which you have to be looking at. So on the right here, I've got kind of a diagram of like, well, this is what happens when you make the Markov assumption. You're only looking at these 5 potential causes for this event. But if you don't make the Markov assumption, suddenly you've got all of these different potential things, and you've got it. And as you know, or as most of you will know, if you need to, if you have a lot of degrees of freedom, or if you have a lot of kind of potential different causes of an event, then you need just a ton of data to kind of give a general story, like really detect all of those patterns in a kind of very general way. So we need some kind of way of either cutting down on the options, or promoting some as like more possible than others, or doing something like that. And the suggestion is, well, look, if the problem is there's just this huge complexity and there are all these possible degrees of freedom, and we need a way of kind of simplifying things in a useful way, narratives could well play that kind of role. So one reason to think about this is if you think about the practice of history, right? So in history, you can approach it, this is simplifying, but you can kind of do 2 kind of things, right? So one is you can use really general social science models, and that will explain certain kinds of things, and that's really great. But if you try and apply just some really general social science model to a particular event, it's going to miss a lot of stuff. It's going to really miss out on a lot of the details of the causation of the event. And so that seems to be a reason why, historians still use narratives. Like, it's not the only thing which they use, but they still use narratives to explain particular events. Another reason you might suspect that narratives help here is that they span times, right? Which is the kind of underlying problem for Markov properties, for kind of non-Markovian dynamics. Okay, so can we say a bit more than this by kind of considering some typical features of narratives? Yeah, I think we can. So, it's really controversial what defines a narrative. And I don't really want to take a stand on that. But for our purposes, like, what seems to be important to the debates which we've been talking about are at least these kind of features. So one is, look, a narrative is going to kind of represent a temporally extended structure of events. It's going to represent those events as kind of connected to each other somehow. Often it's going to involve psychological connections or causal connections. Often it's going to use schemas. So there's going to be certain things like the revenge narrative where, there are certain sorts of patterns which are kind of known, and we kind of attribute them a lot in building narratives. Also, it's going to involve these kind of really long, narrow threads of events. So what do I mean by that? Well, generally a narrative is not going to talk about everything happening at each time period, which it's talking about. It's just going to talk about one event and the one event which caused that, and the one event which caused that, and the one event which caused that. So it's going to be kind of narrow in that it's not talking about all of the different events at a given time period, but it's also going to be long in that it's going to go quite a way back. Also, narratives, they tend to be quite perspectival, quite partial. So I think in both in this respect, they're kind of like, you can think of them like scientific models, right? That scientific models make a lot of simplifications in order to bring out kind of interesting, like the most important factors in some explanation. But whereas scientific models tend to be looking at like a lot of details of what's happening at a particular time period, the narratives will kind of cut down on lots of those details in order to add more prominent details kind of going back through time. Okay, so these are some kind of important features of narratives. And so why would they be useful for detecting these kind of connections which you wouldn't get with a kind of Markovian system? Well, remember the basic problem with detecting non-Markovian dynamics in a kind of very general way is that there are just too many options, right? But narratives are going to help you cut down on a lot of the different potential options because, well, one, you're only explaining just one event or a small number of events and how that came about. So you're not even trying to give kind of a general pattern. Two, you can use these schemas which kind of, will make certain kind of possibilities particularly prominent to look for. And then given that, you can do this kind of activity of like, well, I think these two events, which are quite temporally distant, might be quite related actually. And so I'm going to kind of see if I can fill in the gaps. And then, you can kind of trace these potential chains of influence, which you would just miss if you weren't looking for them. So if we just go through the example of Alice again, so she is snubbed in 2000, and then she kind of goes on this vengeful rampage. And you're trying to explain why on earth has she gone on this rampage? Like her behavior in the last 10 years wouldn't have predicted this. Well, you can start using scripts or schemas. So we're kind of primed to look for like, well, given that she's going on this rampage, what might have caused it? Well, one possibility is that she was snubbed a long time ago and we need to go and look for that. Or you might just kind of look back through her life and find, well, here are some kind of potentially important events. Can we connect these to this event? In this case, yes, we can. And then once you've done this kind of filling in, you kind of have a better understanding of her because you've started positing some of the hidden states and you started understanding the world a little bit better, like this little sliver of the world. Okay, so given this, it would make sense that RL would be kind of like, if what we're trying to do is maximize expected utility and RL kind of isn't great in non-Markovian situations, it would make sense to kind of supplement it with some kind of heuristic which uses narratives, right? Because that kind of a heuristic is going to pick up on some of the failures to maximize utility, which just straight like bog standard RL is going to fail to do. So given that, we can kind of actually give a kind of deeper explanation of Velleman again about why we might have these preferences about the shape of our lives, right? So, he starts with, there's this shape of our life, here's the explanation, then we prefer some narratives over others. And then I'm going to say, well, look, the reason that we prefer some narratives over others is this. What we're kind of, in some sense, trying to do is just maximize utility. But the way that we're doing that is using these heuristics and these kind of grab bag of tools, which are kind of imperfect. And so if you just stipulate that these things have this, these two lives have the same utility, that doesn't really register in the systems which we're actually using for kind of evaluating the system, for evaluating the options. What registers is these kind of more heuristic things. And one of those heuristics is going to be, well, which one has a good narrative, right? And the reason that we might want a life with a good narrative is just, well, it fits into these patterns, so we can kind of actually be, like, it's a sure bet that this kind of life is going to have a higher utility. And so, yeah, so the basic explanation is, look, yes, we prefer lives with a better narrative, or a narrative which kind of fits into a certain pattern. But the underlying reason is really just that we're kind of imperfectly trying to maximize utility using narratives as kind of one kind of heuristic. So this view seems like it can explain everything Velleman wants to explain, but it also has this other thing which it can do, which it can avoid all the worries which I raised for his view, right? Because here, narratives are not like the thing which we're aiming at in themselves. They're just a heuristic which we're using as an imperfect kind of just one tool amongst many for understanding this really complex thing like a whole human life, and trying to evaluate it with respect to utility maximization. So it's not sentimental at all. It's just kind of a shortcut, a cognitive shortcut for doing a really complicated task. It doesn't matter that you've got multiple conflicting narratives of a life, because the way that we're using narratives is just kind of like models. Like, it's useful to have multiple conflicting narratives because they're both simplifying and distorting in various ways, and they're kind of supplementing each other by each picking up on stuff which the other one is missing. And finally, it's fine that you don't want to be Don Giovanni. You don't want to kind of fit into just a satisfying narrative in itself, because a satisfying narrative in one sense is just like a narrative which sheds a lot of explanation on a scenario. And that's not what we're aiming for. We're aiming to use having a satisfying narrative as a way of kind of getting at, well, which scenario actually has the higher total utility. Okay, so yes, we don't have time to talk about death, but we do have this conclusion, which is, it does make sense that we choose lives that kind of make for a good story, but this doesn't mean that there's more to rationality than utility maximization. And it doesn't mean that animals are kind of in this like fundamentally different boat to us with respect to utility maximization. Because even if animals can't use narratives in like this really complicated way of picturing their whole life in terms of a narrative, or understanding literary genres or anything, they can use all kinds of other like also imperfect tools for getting at utility maximization. And it would be certainly interesting to study in greater detail what kind of tools they might use. Okay, so thanks.
And our final talk is from Robyn R. Waller and Russel Waller, and it will be titled "The Machine Mind: Beyond Transparent Biases." Robyn Waller is assistant professor of philosophy at Iona College, where she also serves as a neuroscience faculty advisor. Her research interests include philosophy of cognitive science, especially neuroscience and AI, philosophy of mind, metaphysics, especially free will, and bioethics, with a focus on neuroethics and medical ethics. And Russel Waller is an independent machine learning contractor. He's a co-founder and former chief research officer at the fintech startup, Moduli Technologies. I hope I've said it correctly. And he has a PhD in mathematics with a specialization in topology. So I'm excited to welcome them both for this talk on the machine mind. And I'll pass it over to you, Robyn.
Thanks. Let me pull up the slides here.
Yeah.
Can everyone see that okay? Okay, I'm just going to move the... Do you know how to move the participants box down? Is that something I need to do first?
Does it disappear, maybe?
No, hold on. Sorry, I'll be quick.
That's okay. Take a time to orient yourself.
I got it. I just needed to move the participants box. Okay, great. Thank you for that introduction. So as noted, the title of our talk is The Machine Mind: Beyond Transparent Algorithmic Bias. I will be kicking it off with a background on algorithmic bias as discussed in the current literature and algorithmic fairness initiatives. and then I'll hand it over to Russ, who will make the case for the emergence of a novel kind of algorithmic bias with the use of machine learning. And then we'll quickly wrap it up with the implications for explainable and ethical AI. Okay, so we as human decision makers tend to uncritically accept the output of automated decision-making systems, such as artificial intelligence, and this is a psychological phenomenon known as automation bias. So the reliance on these kinds of systems can reduce error in some conditions. You can think of a luxury car's monitoring system for lane drift, for instance, but reliance on these systems can introduce new kinds of errors in decision-making. And we know here, of course, that algorithmic decision-making systems are ubiquitous in society. They construct predictive models and aid in decisions in diverse domains like recruiting and hiring, finance, policing and detention, credit lending, medicine, marketing, and others. We'll go through some examples too. Okay, so in the case of machine learning, which will be our focus today, we're going to talk about a type of error that's received a great deal of attention recently, and that's algorithmic bias. So we're going to focus specifically with machine learning with this topic. We're going to characterize algorithmic bias as the bias toward or against marginalized groups that algorithms inherit from the data set in which they operate. Now, in this way, seemingly neutral machines replicate our own societal biases, and so not only encode, but also perpetuate social inequalities when they're used on the basis of high stakes decision making. What we'd like to do today is to make the case for the emergence of a distinct kind of algorithmic bias, specifically generated using machine learning. But before we do that, let me walk you some examples of algorithmic bias as it's currently discussed. So countless examples of algorithmic bias have been documented with the use of machine learning and artificial intelligence. I'll give you an example from hiring. So investigative reports detail machine learning tools that run the risk of filtering candidates for a job according to similarities to previously successful applicants. Now that might sound desirable, but insofar as past hiring decisions contained bias, then we're going to be replicating that earlier bias in these decisions. So this algorithmic bias in weeding out, say, early round candidates is all the more prone to bias, for instance, if the industry for which it's being used is not itself representative of the general population. So you can think of a training set of past successful quote unquote applicants to a tech firm being used to extract features of suitable or qualified candidates for a new tech job that opens. Due to the underrepresentation of certain demographics in the training pool of the past qualified candidates, those underrepresented in the industry, say women, right, are further biased against in the selection process. And moreover, the program will optimize performance for any group that's prominently represented in the features of the training set, leading to more accurate, so to speak, judgments about those individuals. So ironically, reliable technology that the company may be using to route out their human implicit bias in hiring can be perpetuating that bias. Okay. Now, as we know, often the outcome of these biased algorithmic processes is a weighty one, morally and politically. So for instance, machine learning decision-making is utilized for predictive policing as well as in parole decisions. We'll look at policing first. So here, police officers using these tools can decide to send more officers to patrol neighborhoods classified as high crime by the algorithm based on past crime data. So this seemingly innocuous, you might think, efficient distribution of public resources is problematic given the problematic nature of the crime data it relies on, right? So certain communities, for instance, such as Black and Brown communities, have been historically over-policed, and the training crime data thereby plausibly overrepresents those communities and those zip codes as high crime. And this can lead to a vicious feedback loop of bias. So when further data comes in on crime by zip code, those zip codes will continually be overrepresented due to the enhanced police presence there due to the algorithmic influence. Another great example that's well known is the example of COMPAS. So this is a program used to predict recidivism. And machine learning programs trained on past offender data, it's been reported, have double the false positive rate for predicted recidivism of Black offenders compared to white offenders. Okay. All right, so what's the source of this algorithmic bias? So the algorithmic bias that kind just exemplified is typically explained as originating in societal bias that's reflected in the training data used to develop the predictive model. So here the marginalized group negatively impacted by the algorithmic driven decision has either been underrepresented or overrepresented in the training set. So the examples from law we mentioned feature overrepresentation of marginalized groups. Other cases feature marginalized groups as underrepresented, like that hiring example. Okay. Now, note that we're able to fairly quickly and easily recognize this bias when it arises and contributes to social injustice. And this, what we'll call transparency of bias, can be explained by the fact that the algorithmic bias stems from the machine learning's tendency to replicate biases we're actually familiar with and we're keenly attuned to. So these are biases that we ourselves as humans have perpetuated explicitly. You can think of racial and gender biases as prominent examples of this. And indeed, anyone familiar with machine learning, the mechanics of it, might predict this, right? So a key component of machine learning is this requirement of a training set. And that training set's used by the program to measure nodes or individuals on whom it seeks to make predictions or place values. So it will be trained according to our past societal classifications, descriptions, and judgments, and it'll thus learn and perpetuate those societal biases that we as humans exhibit. So this is a nice example of that garbage in, garbage out adage that we see. Okay. Now, how do we address algorithmic bias? One thing that might come to mind for you is that why don't we simply remove the problematic features, right? So one remediation could be to, so to speak, blind the program to the source of the bias. That would be to remove a feature from the data points being considered. So for example, you could remove race from a list of characteristics a program is given about individuals in order to sever that program from our racial bias as a society. Now, in fact, the nature of machine learning is such that this will often further incline the machine toward bias with respect to that feature. So in this sense, machine learning algorithms like humans are prone to implicit bias. A nice example of this concerns the legal and academic discussion of Facebook's ad delivery system. So recently, Facebook settled this lawsuit regarding the permissibility of advertisers to exclude certain demographics of users from viewing content. So they had these gender stereotype job ads like childcare for women. And the company's policies were then modified accordingly, preventing these advertisers from setting feature parameters around protected classes. Still, even with more inclusive and intentional targeting, it's been reported that the ad delivery algorithms led to cases of gender stereotype distribution of ads, among other kinds of stereotyped delivery. So one question you might have is, how does this implicit algorithmic bias arise? And one explanation that's been given here is that although the sensitive demographic data is not explicitly represented in the initial feature space, other feature parameters that are correlated with the demographic data central to bias are. So these associated or correlated features are called proxy features, and there's been a lot of discussion of this. So for instance, zip code is a proxy feature of race in the US, given the historical and geographical distribution and segregation of certain communities in the US. Given that the proxy features track the same human biases operative in the social world that the socially sensitive ones do, the systems encoding and operating over the proxy features reproduce and reinforce the same societal bias against marginalized groups. So interestingly, processing-wise, it's as if the sensitive demographics are explicitly encoded, even though they are in fact not. Okay, there are other ways to address algorithmic bias and other ways to explain the persistence of it in this implicit way. So another explanation of this implicit algorithmic bias appeals to the procedures of machine learning themselves. So we know that a defining feature of machine learning programs rather, is their explicitness in adjusting to and learning from their mistakes, so to speak. So machine learning will hazard a rough and even a random attempt at an initial prediction on its training set and then model the error that it finds and do so iteratively. So if you blind a machine to a particular feature, that generally serves only to prevent the machine from discovering its own bias with respect to that feature. So we need better mitigation and elimination techniques. And so there's been this vast discussion of how to achieve algorithmic fairness. So I'll just mention a few tax solutions. One that's been proposed and has been implemented is implementing AI audits. So an auditor in this case is an algorithm itself that identifies bias in the training set and the predictive model for the system. Other proposed solutions are to feed the program counterexamples to social stereotypes in the training set, and that's meant to counterbalance the bias in the training set. A related approach is a programmer can provide the program with additional features that strikes the practitioner as plausibly pertaining to the task. And the idea here is that any well-constructed model should yield more accurate predictions when the practitioner feeds in more data in this case being the features. There are costs to these tech solutions. So for instance, the cost of the throwing more features in the soup solution is to further make opaque, for instance, the black box nature of advanced machine learning. So as Russ will attest to, and you may well know, right, machine learning programs operate in unimaginably high dimensional feature spaces. If we make this a more complex system, we're all the more going to hide that remaining bias from the users and the programmers. So there is this accuracy explainability trade-off that occurs. Okay, a big movement now in the literature is to talk beyond text solutions, to talk about algorithmic fairness as a political goal. I think that's a very important topic. For time's sake, I'm gonna not discuss it in depth. Okay, so we've discussed examples of how machine learning algorithms can replicate our existing societal biases, either due to bias reflected in the training set or in proxy features. And we've mentioned a few proposed methods to route out bias in machine learning. So what's crucial to note at this stage is that all of this work turns on our recognizing the bias in the training set, in the predictive model, in the decisional outcomes. But what we'll now argue is the distinctive nature of machine learning actually enhances the likelihood of an emerging new kind or type of algorithmic bias. And this kind is epistemically more pernicious and could be more, therefore, ethically problematic. So I'm going to turn it over to Russ for this part of the talk here. I'm going to switch chairs. Okay. Sorry, we're switching chairs. We have a small office.
We do not have a large office. All right, so as Robyn mentioned, we're going to try to turn our attention to this challenge then of trying to recognize new types of bias that the machines are generating that's distinct from the types of bias that Robyn was outlining that relate to our own biases, where the machine is tending to recreate or exacerbate existing biases that we have that exist in the world, and we want to look instead at potentially new biases that the machine itself is introducing. And one note here is that one challenge of this is that these biases may not be, as I'm calling it here, statistically evident. And by that, I just mean it might not be as simple as group A is being overrepresented, group B is being underrepresented, and we can look at that statistically and see that that's the case. In general, in machine learning, if it's done correctly, it should guard against that and not do that for the features that we give it. So that won't always be the case. So to distinguish this kind of bias that we're talking about more generally, we're going to want to have an idea of what we mean by machine learning. What is it about machine learning in general that leads us to this kind of bias? So in particular, we're going to distinguish machine learning from statistics and sort of treat statistics as a base case, if you will, of machine learning. So statistics, we're calling the description of behavior of a feature or a collection of features in aggregate. And then machine learning can apply statistical tools, but it's doing so on new features that the program is itself creating. So the program will create new features that are more predictive, more discerning of the task at hand, and then use statistical methods on those features. And others, I should point out, have termed this feature learning specifically for deep convolution, have termed this feature learning specifically in the case of deep convolutional neural networks. And we're trying to allow ourselves to be a little more general than that here. And take this new feature creation as the characteristic that we're using for machine learning that's going to create this new bias. So to try to recognize this new bias that machines can potentially be introducing, we're going to lean on a task where we still have, we're still particularly adept and can in some ways outperform machines. So we're going to look at image recognition and in particular drawing a spider. So for comparison's sake, we have a child's drawing of a spider, and then our 7-year-old found out that we were using a child's drawing of a spider that was not his. So we also have our 7-year-old's drawing of a spider, which while he's downstairs watching TV and can't hear me, I'll say maybe looks a little ant-like as opposed to spider-like, but it does have a lot of the sort of key features as we would think of them for a spider, right? It's got this body, right? This sort of two-segmented body, a head, little sort of spider biting things. And in particular, the thing to really note is it's got this characteristic that we really think of as being, for us, defining of spiders. It's got these 8 legs. In case you're fortunate enough to have never seen an actual spider, here's a comparison of an actual spider with that child drawing. And if we compare that then to a very strong machine's attempt at doing the same thing, at drawing a spider, we immediately, all right, I'll try to get us to lunch, but oops, sorry. We immediately, if we just look at this on the face, these are obviously very impressive depictions of spiders. We could be fooled just looking at it, initially thinking that we're looking at actual pictures of spiders. And in fact, if we were told that there were some actual pictures of spiders included in this, we certainly wouldn't balk at it. But one thing to note, especially having referenced the 8 legs in our child's drawing as being exemplary, is that this is something that, as strong as this machine is at depicting spiders, this really fundamental aspect of what we consider a spider, that it has 8 legs, is notably not getting it right. The machine is struggling with this aspect. And we're not just pointing this out to harp on the fact that machine learning is still imperfect, that it still doesn't perform every task exactly as we would hope it would. But in particular, looking at these spiders, and I'll zoom in on one in particular to get a look at it. But while some of them I think do actually have 8 legs, what's noteworthy is that the spiders that don't have 8 legs, the spiders for which the machine is missing on this key feature, it tends to have, they almost universally will have more than 8 legs. We're getting extra legs to our spiders. And this, if you Google AI generated images of spiders, this is a characteristic trend. You'll see that they generally have more than 8 legs if they don't have the right number of legs. And this is just a really sort of good, clear example, easily definable example of a more general trend when it comes to AI depictions of images. Is that they tend to take features that we would associate with those images and exaggerate them. AI winds up being a fairly skilled caricaturist, and we'll see some examples of cute dogs at the end to offset the creepiness of spiders. But it makes these creepy spiders creepier. It'll make cute dogs cuter. So this is an example. Then this is sort of a starting point of a machine-generated bias, right? This bias, these extra legs that it tends to generate, it's not coming from the real world, right? It's not mimicking the bias that we've introduced into spiders by giving them extra legs, right? It's not introducing our own biases. Even our 7-year-olds realize that spiders have 8 legs. This is a machine-introduced bias. And as we sort of dive in, I'm going to try to skip ahead for the sake of time a little bit. As we sort of dive into why we're getting this bias in machines, note also that one nice thing about this task, this example, is that it's trivially the case that we're not going to get any statistical bias from this. It's so trivially the case that it's almost not obvious. But think for a minute on what the actual features that we're giving the machine in this task are, right? And some of the problems Robyn was outlining, we saw a variety of features. For this one, we're getting extremely simple features. We're just getting for each pixel a grayscale coordinate and a grayscale value, and then that pixel's coordinate. So there's no way we're going to find any statistical bias for this, even though we're exhibiting some kind of bias in what the machine is doing. We're not going to be able to say it's disproportionately choosing darker pixels over lighter pixels in what it considers a spider, right? We're not going to be able to uncover the bias in this sort of simple statistical way. And then, in the interest of getting you all to, all right. So I'm going to sort of gloss over shamelessly, so the methodology of how we're doing this in order to actually have time to do it. But essentially, you can sort of think of this as we're taking a machine learning algorithm, something like a neural network, and we're replacing that sort of notorious hidden layer, the black box aspect of it, with pictures, so that we can get a clear sense of what the machine is actually doing, in trying to understand what the machine sees as a leg compared to how we understand what we consider the feature of leg, in order to try to get a better understanding of why the machines are making these extra leggy spiders. So we start with the feature that we're given, which is just the grayscale value, right? And the feature, the computer, the program, is doing the only thing it can with it, right? It's distinguishing how dark or light it is, right? That's the most basic feature. And from this very basic feature, this 1 pixel feature, it's then going to combine these features in ways to try to get a better picture of what's going on as we zoom out and look at features of the spider more globally. So if we look at, for example, how these 1 pixel features are then being combined to form the features of slightly bigger look, these 2x2 boxes, these 4 pixel features. And right here in this picture, each node in this picture represents one of these 4 pixel boxes, one of these 2x2 boxes of adjacent pixels. And you can see already the color represents the average grayscale value of those 4 pixels. And you can see already that this first feature, right, dark versus light, is already starting to split into new features, particularly for the dark pixels on the left here, as opposed to the lighter pixels on the right. And if we look at a few sort of exemplars of these features, so what the computer's doing here is it's combining the initial features we give it to try to get these new features that it's then going to use to predict, to create more features and get a better understanding of whether this thing is a spider in the picture, the black and white picture that we're looking at. And so looking at sort of a few exemplars of some of these features that are starting to emerge, these arms in the picture here, we can see these sort of contrasts in the black and white pixels sort of coming together to form new features that we've highlighted here. And the reason that these features are then being formed, the reason that it's selecting for these features at this point, we can get a better idea of if we go out just a little bit more. So again, look at these patterns and then how they would then be used to make this new feature here. And I have spider with a question mark here. We have spider with a question mark. But this is obviously, this is sort of the first point at which we can start to look at this. And clearly we don't have any real solid conception yet of whether the picture that this thing is looking at is in fact a spider. But we can start to see some object here. We could potentially look at this pattern and see that this might be a very, very zoomed in look at a spider leg, potentially. There's no way to actually know that yet, but it's starting to look like it might be. In fact, it is. And if we look then at the features that we're getting when we zoom out and look at these 4x4 features that we're getting from piecing together these 2x2 features, in fact, where we have this red dot here for that type of pattern, this is what the machine is starting to recognize as a spider leg, and it gets a very, very clear, distinct feature from that, as you can sort of see from how the way the visualizations that we have sort of separate these patterns. But we get this very kind of clear feature that corresponds to this sort of pattern that pieces together to form part of our spider leg. But again, and this is sort of the crucial point here, we can't know just from this whether we're looking at a spider leg. This could still very obviously be many, many different things. So all these other features that it's starting to form are still going to have to work in conjunction with this new feature that we're finding, that we're sort of tempted to think of as spider leg, to form better ideas of whether this is actually a spider leg. So the upshot of this, why we're getting these extra legs, is that the pixel patterns that comprise legs are more immediately apparent and distinguishable. These patterns can be more readily used to identify the features that are really core to being a spider, these creepy spider legs. But sort of paradoxically, because leg is so important in defining what it means to be a spider, it's never going to get its own feature, a strict feature in this sense for the machine. Rather, this very important feature is going to be spread across many, many different features at many, many different levels of feature creation. And so we're going to get some semblance of leg early on in features that are then used to create more features that are used to create more features that are then used to give us a clear idea of, yes, this is indeed a spider leg that's being used to that's part of an actual spider. But because it's being sort of generated through all of these layers of feature creation, we're never going to get a really crisp idea of this is a spider leg the way clearly our 7-year-old does. And also this is then why that notion of spider leg tends to be compounded through these features, and why we tend to get leggier spiders, for example. And I'll send it back to Robyn in a second, but there are a lot of consequences of this, and I'll just sort of highlight one sort of more notable consequence that can come from this. So again, in general, even with this kind of bias, it can be really difficult to tell, as we can in the case of a spider, say it's biased in that it has too many legs, it's too leggy. It can be very difficult to sort of label this type of bias in general. But we can get a pretty good idea of which groups are being exposed to this type of bias by how they split in the early features. We can look at how they're passed through the feature space and how they're being used to create more features. And one sort of often dramatic effect that we get from this is, again, even though the machine, so long as we give it all the factors that we're looking at, will work to avoid any statistical bias that we would be able to recognize as favoring this group over another, the features themselves that it's creating can be skewed towards one group. If one group is more involved early on in the features that are splitting early on and then making up new features and so on in this way, which will tend to be the case if that group is more conspicuous to the machine, right? If it's more sort of entrenched into the features that we have, then changes to that group, because they're disproportionately affecting the features that are relating it to other groups, changes in that group as that group evolves, as that group changes, as we change the way we're evaluating that group, can then have very outsized, exacerbated, dramatic effects on how we view other groups. And that's often where you start to see these really sort of dramatic, newsworthy cases of bias that then become too late, immediately recognizable, right? But I'll cut it off there and let Robyn finish up for us.
Apologies for the chair shift. This is like a storage closet in the New York City area. All right. Oh, here's some
Oh, yeah.
pictures of some adorable AI hounds.
Extra adorable, exaggeratedly adorable.
From the DeepMind project. Though they are a bit wonky if you look at them.
Right.
I'll put it on in the end so you can see. Okay, so I'm just going to take 1 minute to wrap up with the implications for explainable and ethical AI. So we've argued that given the distinctive generative processes of feature creation using machine learning, we can have the emergence of categorically new bias. And this is because we have complex reconfiguration of the initial features that encode social information. And what we've argued, or if we had more time, we'd even more fully argue, is that this kind of algorithmic bias is distinct from the already discussed algorithmic bias in two senses. One, it's distinct in content. So the emergent kind of algorithmic bias forms algorithmic ensemble groups that do not correspond cleanly to the groups or biases we see in our social landscape. So there's a difference in content. That's going to make it really hard for us to identify and route out this bias. The other distinction is a distinction in source. So whereas the bias I talked about earlier has its source in the training set, here we're saying that this bias emerges specifically from distinctive features of machine learning, of feature creation or feature learning. So it's not encoded in the training set. And so that will also have implications for how we ought to address this and effects it will have. Okay, and then just to quickly wrap this up, assuming we're correct about this, that there are these novel kinds of algorithmic bias operative in our algorithmic decision-making systems, this is going to skew over time the criteria of what makes individuals successful or selected, who is seen as employable, who's seen as rehabilitated, who's seen as creditworthy. And so this has the potential to wrong individuals and marginalized communities in ways that escape our attention because it's harder to, it's less transparent, and notably goes beyond existing privacy and anti-discrimination laws. So does not correspond cleanly to protected classes. But I will leave it at that because I know we went a bit over. So thank you. This is a real dog. This is our dog, not an AI dog. Thank you.
And let's just say a thanks again to all the speakers as well.